In the last lecture, I was talking to you about the booming economy of the post-war period, and I had made mention that what this does, this vibrant economy, is it opens up middle-class life to millions and millions of Americans that really could have only dreamt of something like that before the war broke out. I had also made mention that the economy did boom, that prosperity was real, but, the wealth wasn't as equally distributed as we wanted it to be. I had mentioned three groups that really didn't necessarily roar through the 1950s. They kind of limped along. One was city dwellers. Another was immigrants, recent immigrants. And lastly, people of color, especially in the urban areas. These groups are generally unaffected by this post-war boom that is opening up middle class, and generally speaking, what historians refer to these groups as in the 1950s is the other America. In other words, this isn't suburbia, this is the other America of the 1950s. Now we know that when these veterans began coming back home, began getting jobs, many of them left the inner cities. They left inner city Detroit, they left inner city Oakland, and they relocated into the suburbs. As they relocated, though, that urban landscape began to decay, and we begin to see some fairly significant problems in the city, which is why it's such a problem that this other America, city dwellers are largely not included with what we've been talking about as far as that post-war economic boom. Okay, but it's not really going to be a priority of the American government, really the American people, to address this issue of urban poverty, at least not in the 1950s. I mean, outside of the American South, poverty pretty much goes unannounced, unaddressed. Okay? So anyway, let me start out by talking to you about immigration and, to a lesser extent, migration into these cities. The first group that I want to mention are Asian immigrants. Now, we know that ever since 1924, Congress had really put a lid on immigration really outside of Northern and Western Europe, and we know that there was such a thing as the Chinese Exclusion Act, which all but forbade Chinese immigration to the United States. In 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act lifted that ugly stain, and what you begin to see are immigrants from these diverse, non-traditional sources, places like Eastern Asia, Southern Asia. They begin to come to the United States, and they diversify the United States. And these immigrants are largely coming and settling in the cities. In 1943, the U.S. government established something called the Bracero Program. Now, the word Bracero loosely translates into guest worker in Spanish, and the program was actually quite simple, very similar to what's happening in the farms in the South and the Southwest. People are relocating into the urban North and into the urban West because that's where those defense industry jobs are located, right? And so when they left the farm, they created another crisis, and the crisis was a manpower shortage when it comes to agrarian workforce. Now, obviously, workers on the farm are just as important as workers in the factories in the North, considering somebody needs to grow the food. So what the U.S. government did with this Bracero program is they essentially created a guest worker program sponsored by the federal government that would allow immigration from Latin America, predominantly Mexico, and this guest worker program was designed to supplement the lack of farm workers that the United States was suffering at the time. Now, over the course of the next few decades, it's not going to be until 1963 that the U.S. government officially ends the Bracero program. Hundreds of thousands of people cross the border both ways, back and forth. Now, some of these individuals eventually registered for citizenship and became card-carrying American citizens. Some of them didn't, but in the intermediary time, what they're doing is getting married and they're having babies, and those babies that are being born in places like, San Antonio, Texas, or Los Angeles, California, those are American citizens. So once again, this is immigration to the United States from not necessarily a non-traditional source, but you're seeing an extraordinary amount of increase in immigration from Latin America and Mexico in particular. Speaking of Latin America, another group that I'd like you to be mindful of would be Puerto Rican immigrants. Now, you should know, ever since I lectured to you on the imperial age in American history, that Puerto Rico was a protectorate. It was a territory of the United States, and the people in Puerto Rico were American citizens. As such, they didn't need a passport. They didn't need permission from either government to come to the United States, and you begin to see a lot of people from Puerto Rico coming to New York City. Now, what's happening in Puerto Rico is the mechanization of the sugar industry, which was the main source of economic activity in Puerto Rico. And when that happened, it pushed a lot of people out of work. So these people are looking for a new economic opportunity, and many of them are coming to New York City because during that period, plane fare, a plane ticket from San Juan to LaGuardia Airport in New York was about $55. Now, I know that's insanely cheap by our standards, but you have to understand, back in the time, that was about 2 weeks' worth of wages, but still very affordable. And you begin to see a massive influx of Puerto Rican immigration into New York. And when these people settle, they settle in a very specific part of New York that had always been home to immigrants and migrants, and that would be Harlem, right? They spoke the Spanish language, and the neighborhoods in which they inhabit, and to some extent are still there. You can still see a section of New York City, Harlem, that is clearly Puerto Rican in its heritage. Is referred to as Spanish Harlem. Okay. Cuban immigration picks up during this period. Those of you that are very interested in this time period in American history will be able to tell me that in 1959, Fidel Castro comes to power in Cuba, and he implements a communist regime. A lot of people are very dissatisfied with this revolution, so to speak. And one of the things that a lot of middle-class Cubans begin doing is they begin emigrating to the United States. Now, Cubans are kind of an anomaly when it comes to Latin American immigration, considering Mexicans, Puerto Ricans. They were predominantly working class, predominantly an agrarian population, and when they arrived in the United States, they didn't really have a lot of skills or knowledge, let alone money, to really compete in a 20th century economy. The Cubans were different, and when they began emigrating into places like South Florida, Miami, for instance, they not only brought money with them, some startup capital, they also brought some skills. Many of these people are accountants and lawyers and teachers, and so therefore they have a bit of a head start when it comes to the general experience of immigrants, broadly speaking. I'm not just talking about immigrants from Latin America. You can make a case for the Chinese in the 1870s, or the Irish in the 1850s, or the Poles in the early 1900s. I mean, very few of these individuals were what you would loosely describe as middle-class, skilled workers, right? Now, in terms of migration, again, you see a lot of migration from the south to the north and to the west. Now, of course, you see southern black migrants coming up to places like Chicago, but you also see white migrants as well. And these are migrants from places like Appalachia, Western Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, parts of North Carolina. As a matter of fact, my grandfather came up in the 1950s from the western edge of Virginia to work in the auto factories of Detroit. And he did so because there was a lot more economic opportunity, ability to make money in Detroit than there ever was in Virginia or the Piedmont, right? So anyway, I need you to understand that whether you're talking about Mexicans, whether you're talking about Appalachian whites, whether you're talking about Puerto Ricans, they're headed for the cities, okay? Now, about those cities, that's nothing really new in American history. That's where most immigrants had headed historically in American history. The cities have the same old problems. If you remember reading about Jurgis Rudkis's experience going to Chicago, he settled in Packingtown, the back of the slaughterhouse yards, okay? So housing shortages, dilapidated housing, competition for resources, these weren't anything new in terms of problems. But there are new problems that people like Jurgis Rudkis, an earlier generation of immigrants, didn't have to worry about. And the new problems like automation, okay? Now, for your notes, automation, all I really mean is technology that has robots and robotics replacing the work that human beings used to do in the Gilded Age in the early 20th century. So once upon a time, you would need an actual man, worker, to mount a door on a car or put some tires on a car. By the 1950s, we now have machines that are doing that for us. Now, that's good in the sense that, generally speaking, technological innovation allows us to do more with less, and the price comes down. It's bad in the sense that it's eliminating jobs. I don't know if you recall reading in the Jungle, but it was the first day at the hiring gates that Jurgis got a job. It didn't take him any time whatsoever. These new immigrants that are coming to the United States, places like Detroit, they're going to have a much more difficult time getting a job, because what getting a job involves by now, in the 1950s, is some type of technological know-how. You can't just be big and brawny and strong like Jurgis was and expect to be hired, because you're no longer really talking about an economy that requires a lot of warm bodies, just unskilled workers. Now you need a pretty marketable skill in order to compete, okay? The other problem that the cities have is the loss of a tax revenue. Keep in mind, when those workers began to leave for the suburbs, they took with them not only their families, they took with them their tax revenue. Property taxes were being paid by these middle class and now blue collar middle class Detroiters and Chicagoans and New Yorkers, and now when they went to the suburbs, those municipalities lost that property tax revenue. So they've got the same problems, dilapidated, decaying structures, but they don't have the same kind of money that they once did to fix it. They've got these huge fire departments, huge school districts, huge police departments to support, but not nearly the kind of money that it's going to take to support them, okay? Now, one of the things that you see city governments in places like Chicago, Boston's a good example too, one of the things that they're doing is this process called urban renewal, right? Now, for your notes, urban renewal is exactly what it sounds like it is. It's about renewing the downtown metropolitan areas. So knocking down eyesores, blighted spots of the cities, abandoned factories, and when you raise them, build high-rise luxury apartment complexes in their place. Put important sporting venues downtown. Go ahead and build some attractions that middle-class consumers are going to want to come back downtown and spend some money and generate some tax revenue for. Now, the idea is simple enough, but understand something. There's already a housing shortage as it is. So maybe that north end of Boston is kind of an ugly sight, an eyesore, if you will, but that ugly sight is somebody's home. And you take into consideration the fact that you already had a lack of housing to begin with. You knock down what was there, and now you have something that we call an urban crisis on your hands, right? All the same problems that we saw in the Gilded Age in the cities due to urbanization, lack of housing, health hazards, you name it. But now you take this and you combine it with the fact that you have an immigrant class of people that are showing up without the necessary skills and knowledge to really compete in the 20th century economy. What you've got is a group of people that are trapped in this urban setting and an urban America that cannot really support them the way that they once did. What historians call this is an urban crisis. A group of people that are trapped in poverty, that have very little chance of getting out of poverty, at least on their own, And there's not really too many solutions, at least not in the 1950s, right? But anyway, what I'd also like you to understand about these groups, whether you're talking about Appalachian whites or whether you're talking about Cubans or Puerto Ricans or whomever, they were the subject of racism and discrimination, right? I know this might be a little bit difficult to kind of compartmentalize, considering Appalachian whites were in fact white, and so if you say they were the subjects of discrimination, that might not compute, considering, you know, discrimination generally discriminates against people of color. In 1955, Harper's Magazine ran this story called "The Hillbillies Invade Chicago." The hillbillies being Appalachian whites from the rural South that would be accused of doing things like putting their cars up on cylinder blocks and fixing them, or sitting on their porches and chewing tobacco. In other words, they were people that you weren't really all that happy about settling in your neighborhood. Now, we've talked about restrictive covenants before in this class, the idea that you want to restrict Jewish families or African-American families, and one of the other people that were systemically discluded from various parts of the city in places like Chicago were Appalachian whites. Okay, so if it's this bad for people that are technically white, how bad must it be for people of color? Well, let me give you a quick example of this. And again, like Emmett Till, it's not often that I can teach you something broader by using a story, but in the case of Felix Longoria, that is certainly true. Now, for your notes, Felix Longoria was a war hero. He had served in World War II. He had served in the Pacific fighting the Japanese. And when the Marines began to reclaim some of those South Pacific islands, the Japanese were retreating, but they were leaving behind snipers, people that would pick off our guys little by little. Now, really the only way that you have to find and root out these snipers is to draw their fire, to figure out where they're shooting from and then go there. In order to do that, you need to get them to fire at you. Well, Felix Longoria volunteered for this mission. In other words, draw their fire so that the howitzers and some of the other artillery could root them out and destroy the snipers. As you might imagine, this was a very dangerous mission, and Felix Longoria ultimately paid the highest price. He died. Longoria was from Three Rivers, Texas, near Corpus Christi, South Texas, and his remains were sent back there. Now, when his remains were sent back, they were sent to the coroner's office, and his wife, widow, I guess you should say, Beatrice Longoria, tried to set up a funeral. She contacted the only funeral parlor in the town of Three Rivers, very small town, ran by a guy named Tom Kennedy. Now, Tom Kennedy was not from Texas. He was actually from Pennsylvania, but he had been in Texas for long enough to see how, the system worked, how racism kind of worked. And when Beatrice Longoria asked to have her husband waked at the funeral parlor, Kennedy told her no. And when Longoria pressed him a little bit more about why that would be, he said the whites would not like it. Anglos would not appreciate a Mexican-American family using the only funeral parlor in town to wake a Mexican-American man. Even this happened to be a war hero. Clearly discrimination, clearly second-class citizen, and clearly something that the Mexican-American community was not going to put up with. I mean, Felix Longoria's story is very similar to Emmett Till in the sense that it reawakens this movement for civil rights, in the sense that Mexican-Americans, like every other group in American society, had paid a very heavy sacrifice, and Felix Longoria was a droplet in a sea of that sacrifice. So the Longoria family contacts this man that was in charge of an organization called the American GI Forum. Okay? Now, for your notes, the American GI Forum was a civil rights organization, and it still does exist, but it does not do what it once upon a time was designed to do. The leader of this organization is an army physician, a guy named Dr. Hector Garcia. Now, what Garcia and the American GI Forum are trying to do is educate either veterans or the families of veterans like Felix Longoria the rights that they were entitled to from the federal government under the GI Bill of Rights. I mean, you have to understand, not everybody knew that they were entitled to a free college education, cheap home loans. And so it was really to help Mexican-American veterans and their families take advantage of these opportunities that they were entitled to from their service. And so Garcia himself pressed Tom Kennedy and said, I don't know if you know this, but we're talking about a war hero here. We're talking about a guy that served his country and served it admirably. Kennedy gave Garcia basically the same line of garbage when it comes to excuse as to why the Longoria family couldn't use this. But what I'd like you to be mindful of is, after getting off the phone with Kennedy, he contacts a newly elected senator from the state of Texas, not that new, but new, a guy from Austin by the name of Lyndon B. Johnson. I'm sure many of you have seen that name around town. There's an expressway, the LBJ Freeway. But anyway, Lyndon Johnson had always had this history of supporting the underdog, or the people that really were at a disadvantage, and clearly that was Mexican Americans in places like South Texas. So anyway, what I need you to understand here is Johnson told the Longoria family, look, I can't force Kennedy's hand here. I can't force him to let you use his funeral parlor, but I can do the next best thing. I can throw my weight around in Washington, and I can make arrangements for your husband to be laid to rest at the National Cemetery in Arlington. That's a really big deal, considering people like, in today's society, people like Jack Kennedy, President Kennedy, are buried there. Anyway, the Longorias take Johnson up on this offer, and that's to this day where Felix Longoria's remains rest. What this does is the same thing that Emmett Till's murder does for the South. It puts the spotlight of racism, in this case Southwestern racism, on display for the entire world to see. And all of a sudden, more and more people, white, black, brown, yellow, red, green, purple, they become very conscious of this racist society, a society that we said we were not going to tolerate after this war to destroy this great evil that had clear connections to racism. We're not going to tolerate that society anymore. So for your notes, we have not been, we're not to the Chicano movement quite yet. Felix Longoria's quote-unquote affair is not really a part of the the Chicano movement, but it's certainly an eye-opening experience for people of Mexican descent when it comes to demanding equality. Now, there's something that I want you to understand about the nature of this movement in the 1950s. It's not radical. We're not talking about a Chicano movement that was led by people that were militantly radical, that demanded not just change, but rapid change and radical change. For the most part, what these people are demanding is change through liberal post-war institutions like the Democratic Party. For instance, one of the things that Mexican Americans and other people of Latin American descent began doing in the 1950s is late 1950s, forming these Viva Kennedy clubs. They were trying to get Jack Kennedy elected to the presidency on the assumption that when he got there, he would appoint people from the Latin American community, and those people would be able to serve the better interest of the broader Latin American community. Now, that's all fine and well, but when you do that, when you go ahead and base your support around this Anglo candidate like Kennedy, what you're ultimately going to do is you're going to be subservient to the whims of people like him. Okay, so he may in fact make good on these promises, and he may in fact not. So at any rate, what you're going to find by the 1960s, the mid and late 1960s, is there's going to be a lot of people that are becoming disappointed in the slow progress of this liberal movement. And of course this applies to the Chicano community, but it's also going to apply to the African American community. I mean, there's going to be people that are going to say the civil rights movement led by people like Martin Luther King, it's not moving fast enough, and we want faster change, we want more meaningful change, and we want it yesterday. Okay? And so that's really where you're going to see people like Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and Reyes Lopez Tijerina, pick up where people like Hector Garcia are going to leave off, where LULAC is going to leave off. And in our next lecture, we're going to be talking about this march of civil rights. We're going to be talking about the election of Jack Kennedy, and we're going to be talking about this, what I call the politics of expectation. So that's where we'll pick it up the next time.